Today on Reasoning Through the Bible, we're going to find out what an idol tastes like. And Steve, I don't know if you've ever wondered what an idol tastes like, but we're going to find out today on our program here in Exodus chapter 32.
I have not, and I don't think I ever want to either.
And let's hope we don't. Hi, and welcome to our guest. We're Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn, and this is Steve. And we're in Exodus chapter 32. And when we say we find out what an idol tastes like, we're going to find that out today because Moses takes an idol, grinds it to powder, and makes the people drink it. There's a lesson in that, as there is in all these things in the scriptures, in the Word of God. We're thankful that you're here with us. A little bit of history. Moses is just now coming down off of Mount Sinai from getting the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments on them. He has just had this conversation of intercessory prayer with God because people had committed sin, and God was ready to cut off Israel. Moses reminds God of the Abrahamic covenant, which was an unconditional, unilateral covenant made by God, and Moses reminds God of that. God then relents and continues to bless Israel. So that's where we are in the story. Today we're going to find out what happens now when Moses comes down off of the mountain. Steve, if you could start in Exodus 32, starting verse 15, and read through verse 20.
Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets which were written on both sides. They were written on one side and the other. The tablets were God's work, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. Now when Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "There is the sound of war in the camp." But he said, "It's not the sound of the cry of triumph, nor is it the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear." It came about as soon as Moses came near the camp that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf which they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it over the surface of the water and made the sons of Israel drink it.
So with that, we have this account here of what happens when Moses finds the people worshiping the golden calf. Let's go back and go through it. Verse 15 tells us that there were 2 tablets, and they were both written on both sides. Now, that has no, as far as I could tell, Steve, there's no theological significance to exactly how those stone tablets were written. There's no spiritual exercise here attached to those. What I take away from those is it was an eyewitness account. Whoever was there that wrote this, namely Moses, knew it because it's accurate history. That's what we take away from this. Accurate history. There was 2 of them, and they were written on both sides, and they were written by God. That just speaks of the authenticity of the book of Exodus. What I think of in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, Paul says to the people of Corinth who were saved by his ministry that they were a letter of God written not on tablets of stone, but written on their hearts. Written on their hearts. So that verse over in the New Testament, where it talks about salvation, this church of Corinth that Paul had put so much energy into and he loved them so much, when he says these were God's word that was written on your hearts and not on tablets of stone, this is what he's talking about back here in Exodus. These things way back here in the Old Testament just give richer meaning to these passages over in the New Testament. That's one of the reasons we study the Old Testament. So then in the story, Moses burns the idol, grinds it to powder, mixes it in the drinking water, then makes the people drink this filthy water. Moses is demonstrating here, he's not fooling around. He's not playing, he's not fooling around. This is serious because God's not fooling around. God is very serious. Whenever we deviate from God's ways, it's very serious. This is nothing we play around with. Yes, God's loving. Yes, God's forgiving. But he's also very strict with what he expects. And it is a frightful thing to get on the wrong side of God.
Well, and what is it that Moses knows that Aaron doesn't know and the people don't know? Moses knows that the people came this close from God wiping them out and starting over with Moses. That's what Moses knows. He did the intercessory pleading with God in order to not do that. This, I think, plays into it, and what's going through Moses' mind as he comes down. He actually sees now what God had told him the people were doing. To me, it's very clear. He's got in his mind that God was so angered at it that he was going to wipe them out, start over with Moses. Moses comes down and he sees the same thing. I think it's also that emotion of, you idiots, you don't know how close that you have come to being completely wiped out. What are you doing? That's kind of what he asked Aaron in verse 21. Aaron, what are you doing? What are you thinking?
So here's a question, Steve. What do you think a burned idol tastes like?
I would say it's probably pretty bitter.
I would say it's probably pretty bitter. That's the lesson. At the beginning, they thought this idol was, we should have a feast, let's have dancing, we should have all this play. In the end, it's very bitter. It's very bitter. It tastes bad. That's the lesson. Whenever we deviate from God's ways, we may think, this is wonderful, I'm having fun, look at this sin I'm in. But in the end, it always leads to a bitter end. In the end, we're in this bitterness, and we really wish we never would have taken this path, that we would have stayed on the true path with God.
We also get another glimpse of Joshua here, in that Joshua is not down there partaking with the rest of the people. He really doesn't know what's going on either. But as we go through this story, we're getting little bitty glimpses of Joshua.
Yes.
And it really plays out later when they send out the spies and you get the character. But you're learning about Joshua in these verses and chapters of Exodus.
Yes, we are. What was Joshua's first thought when he heard the sound coming from the camp?
Joshua thought there was a war going on down there. And he said, it sounds like a war, but yet it doesn't sound like a war. It kind of sounds like maybe there's somebody that's invading the camp, and not really quite sure, because I think I hear music.
Joshua's first thought was of war. Joshua had war in his mind. And that theme plays out throughout Joshua's life. He was never afraid of battle. And throughout the book of Joshua, what is Joshua doing throughout most of the book?
He's always raring to go. He's always ready to take the fight to the Canaanites.
And I remember even towards the end of the book, he was an old man, and he voluntarily took the section of the land that still had giants in the mountains. So he said, let me at them. Let me go fight uphill, fighting giants. Joshua was always focused on war. But that's the first thing that he thought of. Now, Moses gets angry and breaks the tablets. Well, here's a question. Two questions, really. Was Moses justified in his anger? And then was he justified in breaking the tablets?
It's a tricky question on whether or not he was justified in breaking the tablets. The people didn't maybe not necessarily know what was on the tablets, and when Moses threw it down, maybe he was trying to make a point as to how serious the situation was. But it is a clear indication that his anger was out of control, because he shouldn't have broken the tablets, although it is curious that God didn't reprimand him for it.
God didn't reprimand him for it. What's interesting, though, is that it's a righteous anger. It's a righteous anger in the sense that he was angry at sin, as God is angry at sin. And I think here Moses had God's heart, and the anger was justified. I think the anger was justified because it was a great sin, it calls it in the text. Breaking the stone tablets, I think, went over the line. It's just in my opinion, because the tablets were made by God. The tablets were something that had been given to him by God. The symbolism in the story is clear in that Israel's sin broke the relationship with God because they broke his commandments. Therefore, the commandments were broken. That's the symbolism here. But I think Moses' anger got the best of him here, just as it got the best of him in another place. Later in the account goes, he struck the rock at one point when he was only supposed to speak to it.
And clearly, it's not his place to break the tablets. They were created and made by God in his own hand. He did not have the authority to just go ahead and destroy the tablets.
So the next question is about anger and us. What can anger do to a person? The medical profession tells us that when people get angry, the hormones start going in our bodies. what ends up happening is because of all the hormones going on, because of the anger, people literally, physically cannot think straight. You can't think clearly. You can't act clearly. Your body doesn't react the same. Anger will cause you to say things and do things that you normally wouldn't do in cold blood. And I think that's what happened here. Moses had a righteous anger, which is probably justified, but because of that anger, he got so angry he crossed the line. That happens to us. I mean, we say things to our loved ones that we wish later we hadn't have said. And we will do things to our loved ones that later we wish we hadn't done. Therefore, we need to be very careful when we get angry because, again, we will say things and do things that we will regret later.
So a righteous anger might be justified, but we still need to treat it as anger and keep it under control.
Correct. We need to just be very careful and realize I'm angry and I might do something that I'm against. So let's move on to the next section. Steve, if you could read starting at verse 21 and going down through 29, we'll find out what happens when Moses confronts Aaron.
Then Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you that you have brought such great sin upon them?" Aaron said, "Do not let the anger of my Lord burn. You know the people yourself, that they are prone to evil. For they said to me, 'Make a god for us who will go before us.' For this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. I said to them, 'Whoever has any gold, let them tear it off.' So they gave it to me. I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Now when Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies, then Moses stood at the gate of the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered together to him. He said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, every man of you put his sword upon his thigh and go back and forth from gate to gate in the camp and kill every man his brother and every man his friend and every man his neighbor." So the sons of Levi did as Moses instructed, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Then Moses said, "Dedicate yourselves today to the Lord, for every man has been against his son and against his brother, in order that he may bestow a blessing upon you today."
So radical reaction here from Moses to this sin of the idol worship. Very radical reaction. Let's walk through this. In verse 21, Moses uses the term great sin. It says here in verse 21, "What did the people do to you that you have brought such great sin upon them?" Now that term great sin is a strong term. And in the rest of Scripture, it's used in places like for gross sexual immorality. So the idol worship, God views the same way he would view adultery, in the sense that it is a gross immorality, a great sin. It's also possible that the play that was going on was some sort of sexual immorality there. Just to emphasize, this idol worship isn't just sin. It's a great sin. It's of the highest level of sin, and God considers that very, very serious. Do we sometimes, Steve, take sin as serious as God does?
No, we don't, or else we wouldn't commit some of the sins that we do if we took it as serious as God does.
And we need to get more of a godly view of sin. Now, here's the next question. What was Aaron's answer for how the idol was made?
His answer was like about what a little 5-year-old kid would give. I don't know. The people wanted it with God, so I told them, "Give me their gold." They gave me their gold. I put it in the oven, and hey, out comes this calf.
It's just this absurd answer that you wouldn't expect out of a grown man. It just popped out of the fire. Well, what would cause a grown man to give such a ridiculous response?
He's embarrassed about what happened. I mean, he obviously knows that he's guilty. It's kind of a semi-confession, but it's not a full confession for sure.
I think it's just that. It's because he was obviously confronted with his sin and he was ashamed. And it's difficult for us to admit our guilt when we get confronted with our sin. So he just dodged the thing. And instead of looking his brother Moses in the eye, the righteous person, and saying, "I did it, I'm a mistake, I should have done better," he comes up with this ridiculous story. Now, what should we do when we're faced with the same issue? Because we're the same, right? We find ourselves, we wake up one day and somebody's confronting us with sin. If we're not careful, we'll fall in the same trap as Aaron here and tell some other ridiculous story of why I sinned. What should I do if I wake up one day and I'm confronted with my sin?
Well, we need to fess up to it, and we don't need to give some fantastical story because, number one, God knows what's happened, so you're not going to fool him. But when you give such a fantastic story, such as what Aaron did, it's very plain to see that that's not what happened. That's not realistic. So why make up such a story? Just confess to it, discuss it, own it, and move on.
So we'll talk about leadership for a second. Verse 25 says that Aaron let the people get out of control. Aaron was in a position of leadership. He had been left as responsible for the people. Verse 25 says Aaron let them get out of control. Let them get out of control. There's a sense here that the people were out of control morally and that Aaron, the leader, had allowed this. Here's a question, Steve. Are our leaders in our churches responsible for keeping the people within control morally? Is that part of the responsibility of a pastor or a church leader?
Yeah, the word here, I've get out of control, literally it says go loose, let them go loose. The leadership, you're not a leader if you're not going to keep the people together and keep the people focused. That is actually the definition of a leader. If you're leading a flock, you're shepherding a flock, then you have to keep them focused on God. You shouldn't let them control what the situation might be if it's something that is in direct opposition to God. No. So if you have a situation as a leader and you have a group of people and they're saying, let's go do whatever it might be, and it clearly is something that is against God's, the scripture and what God, clearly that God would want, you've got to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do it. If you want to do it, you go ahead, but I'm not going to participate of it. I'm telling you that you shouldn't do it. That might mean that you lose your position or you might lose your job. But in the end, whose side do you want to be on? Do you want to be on God's side or do you want to be on the crowd side?
And a leader is supposed to do just that, supposed to lead and not supposed to let them go loose, as it says here, or go out of control. The leaders are supposed to make sure that the group of people, the congregation, does not get out of control morally, does not get out of control in the sense of what happens in a church, or that's even true for civil leaders. They're supposed to make sure that the people don't get out of control. That's one of the jobs of a leader, is to do just that, is to lead. With that, if you remember here in the story, the people came to Aaron and said, do this for us. And Aaron didn't push back. To push back would have been very unpopular. Here's the next question. Do leaders have to make very unpopular decisions sometimes?
Yes, and they're also going to be held accountable. That's what happened with Aaron when Moses asked him, what did the people do that caused you to bring about this great sin on them? So Aaron, as a leader, had the responsibility to keep them from bringing the sin upon themselves. Whenever, as believers, whenever we are going to be judged, our judgment is not going to be for salvation or not. That's decided. That's already been decided by Jesus, and by our belief in Jesus, our salvation is assured. The judgment that we're going to have is going to be based on our deeds, both good and bad. There is going to be a review, and I'm thinking of myself, are there ever going to be any situations there when it's reviewed before, my life is reviewed before God, where I should have stood up for God and I didn't? I really don't want to think about that, but we need to think about that. And you mentioned civil leaders. Civil leaders have a response, especially believers, Christians themselves. They have a responsibility. And if you have some gross immorality that's going on that you're allowing, you're going to be reviewed and you're going to be held accountable, just like what Moses did with Aaron.
I remember years ago being in a church business meeting, And as part of the church business meeting, the congregation was voting and discussing whether to hire this one staff member for the church. Almost everybody agreed that, oh, this was a good person and we should hire them. One man stood up and said, I don't have a good feeling about this. I don't think we should hire this person. And it must have been hard for him. He gave some reasons, but he was the only one that stood up and said, we should not hire this person as a staff member. And he went against everyone else in the congregation. Time goes on, and that turned out to be a very bad hire. That particular staff person caused all kinds of problems and never should have been brought in. The reason I think back to that one business meeting with that one man, if he hadn't have stood up, then I'm sure that even more issues would have been created, because I just had a lot of respect for him when he stood up alone and said, we should go a different direction. And that's what Aaron should have done. If we ask here, what should Aaron have done? Well, he should have stood up and pushed back and said, no, my friends, my brothers, do not do this. Even if he got shouted down, he should have at least been recorded as saying, I will not stand for this. I will not build this idol. Do not do this. And even if he were shouted down, then he would have been recorded as one who stood up for righteousness instead of one that came up with this fantastic story and made an idol, because that's what he's known for, is his failure.
Yeah, how much more would have been a great answer to say when Moses said, Aaron, what did you do to allow these people? And Aaron would have said, hey, I told them that they shouldn't do this. I told them that that was the wrong thing to do. I told them that they were going to bring judgment upon themselves if they did it. And they went ahead and did it on their own. He wouldn't have had to make up a fantastic story, because that would have been the right thing that he should have done.
Now, take it back home to us. If I wake up one day and somebody approaches me and says, my friend, you've sinned greatly, and I realize that's true, how should I respond to that? How should I respond? Obviously not like Aaron, but if I find myself having done a great sin and confronted with it, what should be my reaction?
It should be one of contrition and one of reflection and one of confession. The opposite side of that is, what happens if you wake up some morning and there's been a burden on your heart of, you know, somebody that has committed a great sin. Should you go and confront them?
Well, we should follow the advice in Matthew 18 to first go one-on-one. And again, small sins, don't shout about the speck in your brother's eye when I've got a log in my own eye. But at the same time, we should indeed help our brothers to not sin. If somebody confronts me with my sin, obviously don't come up with some fantastic story and try to dodge it or get anger and break up a relationship with a friend. Rather, admit the fault and say, thank you, I'll take it to prayer with my Lord, and then leave it at that. So next, in the story, Moses orders the execution of people. He asked people to come to me, all you that want to follow the Lord, come over to where I am. And then he commands the Levites, the priests, to take up their swords and kill every man his brother, every man his friend, and every man his neighbor. And they killed about 3,000 people that day. The situation there was horrible. I mean, they killed all these people. The question, Steve, is, again, Moses is angry, and he orders this execution of all these people. This, of course, begs the question, was this the right thing to do? And it's a very serious situation here. How do we respond to this? Was this the right thing?
Well, before I respond, I want to make sure that with any inductive study that we do, we should always keep in mind, what is the context? What is going on? What is the reason that things happen? At this time, this is Israel coming out of Egypt. They're getting ready to go into the promised land. That's the beginning of their nation. This was a reaction, and you put it a good way. It's a governmental decision. It's a governmental decision of an execution to excise this evil that's out of the camp. And we see that there's estimated 1.5 million to 2 million people that came out of Egypt. Along with them were some other people that were not Israelites. Based on that 3,000 were executed, I get the sense that these are the rabble rousers. These are the ones that stirred up the people. It's been very clear that God was going to wipe all of them out. So all of the people have committed this great sin. But out of 1.5 million to 2 million, and you have 3,000, these are the instigators. The question is, was it right and justified? I think so, in order to get this out of the camp so that it wouldn't happen again, because they're just now getting started. And look at what happened. It's 2 months down the road. These people have instigated this to come up to work, to create a idol and a god and attribute that man-made thing with taking them out of Egypt and to be their god. It's like the pinnacle of what they should not be doing. So these people needed to go.
They needed to be removed from the congregation, which is really what gets down to us is, what do we do with false teachers inside of our churches? Well, one thing, again, just to make really clear to our audience, we should not take the lives of people. That is not our prerogative. We should not kill people. We should not execute people on our own for any reason whatsoever. That is something that's reserved for a civil government to do.
And we're living in a different age and time.
Yes, we live in a different age and time. There have been people in the church in past centuries that would kill heretics. They would burn them at the stake. Of course, we look back at that in horror, and rightfully so, because it was horrible. We shouldn't do that. But we also have to remember that we're not in their shoes. And in those days, the government, the civil government, had a way of thinking and a value system and a religion. To go against the church was the same as going against the civil government. And they viewed it as treason. Now, we'd look at it and say no, but I'm just saying that's the way they viewed it. The burning of a heretic in the Middle Ages was the same as what we would call today somebody that was executing a treasonous person that was compromising the integrity of the government. Different era, different time, as was this here in Exodus 32. So just one more time to our listeners, don't go kill anybody because of religious reasons. Now, what we do have to do with occasionally is, what do you do with a heretic that's in the church? And that's what we had here. Moses said very carefully and very clearly, if you want to follow God, come to me. He didn't say, if you're going to follow Moses, come to, no. It's every man who wants to follow God, come over here, which means the people that didn't come were clearly violating Moses' rule, and at this particular time, they needed to be removed. That was the justification. God is building a nation here. He wanted to be very, very clear. Idol worship needs to be cut out. It needs to be dealt with decidedly. It needs to be dealt with clearly. These are things we do not compromise with. It needs to be removed. And people that wanted to keep that going would have constantly challenged Moses' leadership, would have constantly been bringing this in. Even then, they fought with idol worship throughout the entire Old Testament. This is something that needed to be removed. So the question for us, Steve, is what do we do today? We don't kill people that are heretics. What do we do with heretics that are in the church?
Well, we should remove them from the church. And Paul is specific at one part that, hey, if you have somebody that's doing immoral things, you should remove him from the church and turn him over to Satan so that his soul could be saved. But for heretical things, you can't let them continue to infest the church. And there is a process. You mentioned part of it when you mentioned Matthew. There is a process that needs to be done to correct them. But if they refuse to be corrected, then you got to remove them from the congregation in a peaceful way.
Yes. Yeah, and hopefully in a respectful way, but nevertheless needed to be done. And killing of these 3,000 people was ugly and horrible. And the reason is because sin is ugly and horrible. Idol worship is ugly and horrible. Heresy is ugly and horrible. And it needs to be cut out like cancer. Sin in my life and your life is ugly and horrible. And it needs to be dealt with radically. It needs to be cut out like cancer. We don't play around with it. That's the message here for us, is that if we ever have any sin at all in our lives or in the church, it needs to be removed. And it needs to be removed clearly and cleanly and completely, because that's the message. We do not play around with sin. So any last comments on that, Steve? We're probably getting close to our time.
This has gotten as deep as I thought that it would be, and we still have a little bit left to go.
Yes, we still have some things to learn from the session here on the Golden Calf. We'll be here next time reasoning through the Bible, and we trust that you will as well.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. May God bless you.